A reading from Exodus chapter 32, verses 1 through 14. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." So the next day, the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward, they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They've bowed down to it and sacrificed to it, and have said, 'These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.' I have seen these people," the Lord said to Moses, "and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone, so that my anger may burn against them and I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." But Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. "Lord," he said, "why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt with a great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger. Relent and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self, 'I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever.' Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened." The word of the Lord.
Thanks, Alan. One of my favorite things that I like to do is to have lots of conversations with people who are questioning or exploring faith. Maybe you can already tell by sort of our open posture here at church. If that's you, I'd love to grab a coffee with you and answer any questions that you might have about what it means to be a Christian and why you can actually believe. But one of the most common assumptions around that when I talk to folks who are exploring Christianity is that people tend to think, once I become a Christian, then it's sort of a happily ever after, right? That everything kind of goes according to plan, that your love for God is just thriving at its maximum, that you never disobey, you never doubt ever again, and you live this life of faith that is ever so thriving. And a lot of times, because of that precondition or that assumption, people think, well, that's why I can never imagine myself to be a Christian, because I'm not even close to that. And to that I would say, well, let's go ahead and let's open the Bible, and you can literally pick any place, let's just randomly pick any place, and there is a 99% probability that whatever we read together in there shows not of people who are thriving in their faith, but failing, and failing tremendously. That is the narrative. That is a story of what the Bible teaches, and that tracks very much with the story of the Israelites that we're looking at today. Today, our passage is this infamous passage of the golden calf, where we see on full display Israel's sort of complete and utter failure from what God had called them to live. And it's a reminder, again, like we've said before in this series, that it took just 4 days to get Israel out of Egypt, but it took 40 years in the wilderness to get the Egypt out of Israel. That they weren't ready to quite live the way that God had called them to live, no matter how much they professed to love him. And that is a story not only of Israel, but of us, of all of Scripture, that we often fail more so than succeed. And that is only really good news for us if we're looking to someone who can deal with the fact that we will always inevitably fail. And I want to look at this today because I think it's a very surprising passage, especially in the history of the story that we're tracking. But it's a very informative passage for us to know our own hearts. As we look at Israel's formation and their failure in idolatry, which we'll see is just really, really bad. It's much worse than we think. That also gives us a diagnosis of ourselves and what we might expect in our own faith journey, as well as what the Christian life is meant to look like. And we're going to see today that the Christian life is not a story or a journey of perfection, but it is one of redemption. That's what this passage is really going to make clear to us today. So let's look at this passage by looking at three things, right? Let's look at the anatomy of idolatry, and then look at the heart of sin that reveals, and then finally the mediator for redemption. So the anatomy of idolatry, the heart of sin, and the mediator for redemption. So first, we kind of skipped, we just finished the Ten Commandments. We looked at some of the case laws around social justice the past 2 weeks. And now we kind of skipped to Exodus chapter 32. But the background to this context is that the Israelites are still at Mount Sinai, the place that after God rescues Israel from Egypt under slavery under Pharaoh, he brings them into the wilderness and they camp out at Mount Sinai. And this is the place where God is actually formalizing his covenant relationship. Formalizing, hey, this is who I am, this is who you will be. This is now how you are to relate to me now as my people. You're no longer slaves, you're no longer owned by Pharaoh. You're now my people, and this is how you're now going to live. And that's where the Ten Commandments came in. It was a way for now Israel to live as a new society, as God's sort of glorifying people that all the nations would look to and praise and say, oh, maybe that's what life is supposed to look like. And now, right during our passage, after giving the law, God calls Moses back up to meet with him in the mountain. Right, for 40 days. And during those 40 days that Moses is away, God is showing him, this is how I want you to build this earthly tabernacle. This is going to be the place where you worship me. And so up until this point, everything is going according to plan. God saved Israel. He's making them for his people. They're going to be a light to the nations. They're going to be a new society that shines a light to the world. Until we get to Exodus 32. And now the story takes this drastic turn. Look with me starting in verse 1. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. Now, this is a pretty shocking thing that's happening, especially when you take into account the timeline, right? Just realize that it has just been just a number of weeks, okay? Just a number of weeks since they were miraculously saved through the Red Sea, saving them out of the hand of Pharaoh, where they were miraculously fed manna, bread, every single day for all of their needs, where they saw the manifestation of God in his glory through a pillar of fire and smoke, right? God is doing all of these things, showing them who he is in just a mere few weeks. And now just a little over a month of Moses being away from them, they immediately turn their backs not only on Moses, but on God. And they say to Aaron, the next person in charge, hey, make us gods that will go before us. Now, when you read the story of the Israelites, and as we get closer into understanding them, you start to really get frustrated with the Israelites. Like, they are mad annoying. You know, the story of the Israelites are kind of like the people in your life that you just don't understand. Like, why are you like this? Maybe it's a coworker or a close friend, and you're like, this doesn't make any sense. And when you read the story of the Israelites, you kind of get that kind of a sense. And a lot of times we read this and we say, how could they possibly do something like this? But when we take a closer look at the anatomy of what's causing this idolatry in the Israelites, we actually start to see and understand a lot more, and we start to find a lot more commonality with them. If you look closely, you see that the reason why they turned to Aaron and asked for an idol was that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, right? The Hebrew word for so long, it's not just about sort of impatience, right? The idea that it's connoting is like this immense sense of disappointment, a hope that they had that now is getting dashed. And so that starts to make it a little bit more understandable when you also realize that Moses' role to his people was what? He was the mediator. He was their leader. He was the one that assured them that God was with them. So they would follow Moses, and through that, they would know that God is with them. And so, as former slaves who never had the assurance of love and care and protection, they're not used to this. Now, this Moses figure is gone. And so, with every single passing day, what you can imagine is a growing sense of fear and panic and insecurity, especially as they're exposed out in this wilderness, just waiting on the Lord, on the promise of Moses coming back. They're completely feeling exposed. And the moment that, the reason for that is that they now no longer have this direct connection with this assurance of God's presence in their life, right? Because Moses wasn't there. And so that's sort of the psyche that's going on. And so a lot of times we can read this and we just think this is outright mutiny and rebellion, that these are just evil, horrible, backstabbing people. But when you really look at it and you see that, and you understand their history, you start to see it is much more about their worried hearts that are looking for a place, running to a place for safety. And so they run to Aaron, the next person in charge, and they say, make us an idol. Give us that sense of safety. And I bring that up because I think that also gives us an insight into our own hearts and how we can be just like this. You know, if you've been here for a while, you know that we talk about idolatry a lot. And we simply say that an idol is anything that you look to that is not God to give you what only God can give to you. Right? It's something that you're looking to for your ultimate sense of significance or protection or care or validation, right? And it's usually a good thing that you're looking to, but you make it something that's bigger and higher than God. And we look to this secondary thing to the thing that only God can really and truly give to us. That's what essentially what an idol is. And here's the thing that we learn more deeply about in our passage, that especially in moments of vulnerability, especially when we sense our exposing, and there's a lot of fear around us, and we're in the wilderness, our hearts turn much more quickly looking to idols. And, you know, again, when a slave, a former slave, or call it like an orphan, has never really experienced being fully inside the assurance of love of the Father, right? So just like what the Israelites are going through, when they are outside, disconnected from God, outside the assurance of God's love and his protection, what that starts to do is make you raise all of these questions and things that you can't handle yourself. Well, now I can't secure my future. I can't protect the people that I love. Where am I going to get fed? How am I going to know that enemies aren't going to come against me? How do I assure my future and the life that I am looking for? And when we do that, idols become the most tempting in those moments, because what they always do is that they give us a fast substitute for what only God can provide to us. It's a fast substitute for what only God can provide to us. You know, you may have asked, like, why is it a golden calf of all things, right? The reason why it's a golden calf was that a bull was a very common idol image in the ancient Near East. And a bull, of course, represented a lot of strength and power, but it was also very representative of the presence of a God that it represented. Like, it was the footstool of the place that God rested. And so what they're saying essentially is not to say it's this golden calf that was just made that brought us out of Egypt. That's not the idolatry that's happening here. But what they're actually saying is that this now calf that we have fashioned in our own image as a bull, that represents the God who brought us out of Egypt. And so, of course, this was a blatant, direct breaking of the first and the second commandment that we just went through. Do not make a God in your own image, imagining God however you want, trying to summon his presence and trying to control God. Like, that is what they're doing. And when they're doing that, there is this counterfeit assurance of God's actual presence. It's a counterfeit assurance of his presence. And here's the kicker. It's a counterfeit assurance that what? Did not require Israel to wait on God, did not require Israel to trust in God, but gave this immediate relief to their anxiety and their insecurities. We don't know what's happened to this fellow Moses. What's going to happen to us? We need protection. Give us something at least to worship, because that gives us a sense of immediate control and protection. And it minimizes our sense of vulnerability, our sense of weakness. See, idols always promise the thing that we really, really want at a very little cost, as if you can get it without any kind of vulnerability or trust from us. That is what makes idols so enticing. That is what makes the golden calf so enticing to Israel. The fact that you don't have to wait on God, but you can now put a little bit more control into your hands. You know, a lot of the times we imagine, well, what if God doesn't give me the kind of life that I want, the thing that I really want, or how I want it, or when I want it? And what an idol will do is promise you those things without you taking any kind of risk of trusting, any sense of sacrifice. And this is usually how idols kind of work for us. Typical idols for us, things like career or family or relationships or money or a resume or a status. It says, gosh, I really know, you know, this is the kind of life that I want, and I can't fully trust if God's going to give it to me. So if I can just focus a little bit more on my career and build a little bit more, then I'll finally get the life that I really, really want. Or if I'll just do whatever I need to do just to get married, because then I'll get the kind of life that I really want. And I'm not quite sure if I can wait on and trust in God. If I just really maximize and prioritize my kids' future, and then their future will be set, and then I'll let go, because then I will have the kind of life that I really want without the risk of waiting and trusting in what God is actually wanting to do in my life. And so idols ultimately always say, don't trust him, trust me. Trust in yourself. Trust in just doing a little bit more. Worshiping at the altar of whatever it is the thing is that you sense any sense of security or assurance from, especially in moments of vulnerability. And that sounds enticing, and to our hearts it is absolutely enticing, but here's the foolishness of it, is that though idols always promise a lot, in the end, they always fail to deliver on their promises. They always fail to deliver on their promises. Why? Well, it's not hard to see that idols are not a real God. My man Aaron just made a statue from gold, from the fingers and the plunder of what the Israelites had. What power could that possibly have? And it's just like what Romans 1 says, the foolishness of trusting and worshiping anything else other than God for your ultimate significance. That now in our foolishness, we turned the truth of God for a lie and started to worship the created thing rather than the Creator himself. The ultimate definition of foolishness, because there is no real power, because there is no real God. It is a false image. It is not a real thing that can actually deliver on the thing that our hearts are deeply looking for. And that is why Andy Crouch famously says, the dangerous thing about idols is this, that it always begins by offering great things at a very small price. But then over time, they start to fail us more and more consistently to deliver on their promises while ratcheting up their demands, which seem so reasonable at first. And idols, over time, they will only ask for more and more of you while returning less and less until finally, idols demand everything and give you nothing. That is the definition of death, my friends. And maybe that is something that you have keenly felt, chasing after something. If I just give my life to this one thing, then it'll finally be okay. That sense of protection or peace or hope or joy that I'm looking for will finally be filled. And all you're doing is running yourself to the ground, trusting something that God says you're never to turn to those things, but turn to me. And we see that also in our passage, starting in verse 6. After Aaron fashions this calf, he says, these are your gods that saved you. And he even creates festivals around it. And in verse 6 says, so the next day the people rose early, sacrificed burnt offerings, and presented fellowship offerings. Note, there is no sin offering here that's mentioned. And afterward they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. This is the ultimate end of trusting a false god, any kind of an idol. It does not lead here into Israel's flourishing at all. They are just masquerading as if they have life, when in reality what's really happening here is they are now moving further and further from the God who actually saved them and gives them life. They're moving further and further from becoming not truly human by living the way that God has called them to, but living how they want to, which is ultimately a life of death and destruction. That's the ultimate end of all idols. And we might see here just like, yeah, that is just Israelites. That is so foolish. Why are you doing that? But realize that this is the anatomy of our own idolatry. In our own hearts here and today, that we all have this sense of what kind of life you imagine yourself to live. What is the good life? And the question that reveals your idolatry, your golden calves, is what is it that you are trusting in order to get it? What do you look to in order to move toward that vision of life that you think is going to be flourishing to you? And especially in moments where you feel like you are losing control or you feel exposed or vulnerable, what is the thing that you are turning to give you a sense of assurance, security, comfort, and peace? What do you run to in trust for immediate relief when that welling anxiety comes up in you? That is your golden calf. That is our golden calves. And that's how our hearts operate. But here's the second thing that we see. What Israel's idolatry actually shows us is that the heart of what the Bible calls sin. Now, that's a word that you often hear within the church. And sin is essentially just a transgression. It's a violation against God's law. It's a breaking of God's rules, essentially. But our passage here shows us a much deeper and actually a much worse understanding of what sin actually is when you realize what's happening in idolatry. And you realize that it's not just rule breaking, the way that most of us internalize it, but the heart of sin is relationship breaking. Now, all throughout this passage, we see relationship breaking everywhere. For as this fellow Moses, we don't know what's happened to him. There's this distancing and disowning of this leader and this mediator that they once trusted. And to God, they say, now these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. There was this complete misrepresenting of who God is and who he's revealed himself to be. And so Israel is saying, we don't know that God. This is the God that now we know. And that is why we read now, starting in verse 7, look with me, that the Lord said to Moses when all this is happening, go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them and have made themselves an idol. And now I have seen these people, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger might burn against them, and I may destroy them. Now, we read passages like this in the Old Testament and we think, gosh, there's this wrathful, angry God of the Old Testament. I just want this loving, gracious God of the Jesus in the New Testament. But that is a complete misunderstanding of why this language is being used, why there is so much wrath, judgment, and destruction. Because ultimately what's happening here, this is also rejection language. He's saying, these are no longer my people, but these are your people. Because idolatry, at the heart of it, is breaking relationship with God. And I don't think we appreciate just how deep and painful and miserable this really is. And I want us to think back a little bit to the story of the Israelites that we've been tracking through. As God, from the moment that he revealed himself to Moses at the burning bush, as he saved them through the Red Sea, as he overcame their greatest enemies and brought them out and showed them his 10 commandments, his law of love. You know what God has been doing every single time? He has been revealing himself to his people every single time. He has been pouring out his heart to his people. And so again, we said that the 10 commandments are not just arbitrary laws that will help you flourish. No, the 10 commandments come from the very nature and the character of who God is. And so when he gives them this law, he says, this is now how you are to act. He's actually saying, I'm giving you a piece of myself. And I want you to live with me, in relationship with me. I want to formalize this relationship with you here at Mount Sinai. And in chapter 24 of Exodus, we skipped it, but the Israelites, after receiving all of that and understanding that, you know what the Israelites all say? They say, we will do everything that the Lord commands. We will obey you. They were essentially at Mount Sinai making marriage vows to one another, where God is formally saying, I rescued you so that you will be my people, and I will be your God. And now this is how we are to relate. That I don't want you just to know of me, but I want you to know me. To be in relationship with me, a deep, intimate covenant, special relationship with me. That is what's happening. You know, a lot of us might imagine God as this distant, holy, powerful, authoritative figure that's out there somewhere that's maybe holy. And we read the Bible and we can totally miss the central idea of what God is actually wanting to communicate through the entire thing. And he's saying, yes, that is me, but do not miss that at the heart of it, it is a God that wants to be in relationship with you. Now, I want you to imagine the person that you love most here on this earth, that you are so, so deeply committed to. Maybe that's a spouse, maybe that's a family member, maybe that's a close friend where you've gone through a lot, where they really know you and you know them. And I want you to now imagine you loving them so much, showing your care for them, sacrificing for them constantly, and them responding as if they don't care. Them not receiving that at all, but treating you as if you don't matter, or misrepresenting you. Or worse, maybe some of us have actually experienced this, experiencing a complete betrayal from that person, where they completely break your trust, completely break that relationship. That is a heartbreaking thing that's happening. Same thing here with Israelites and God. Here's what commentator Philip Ryken says. He says, the Israelites had every reason to believe that God knew what he was doing. He had brought them out of Egypt. He had saved them in the desert. He had given them his law. Every day he provided bread from heaven. And if they needed any further reassurance that he was there for them, all they needed to do was look up and see his glory on the mountain at Mount Sinai. God was not absent. He was right there with them in their situation. Yet they doubted. That is the heart of sin, and why God now is filled with so much anger and wrath and judgment. And maybe now you can relate a little bit if you realize how much, if you've ever loved someone or loved something so, so dearly, you know this to be true, that the measure of your righteous anger and your wrath and your judgment is directly correlated to how much it is you love that person. His anger, his wrath, his response comes because he covenanted with Israel. And that is what makes idolatry so, so heartbreaking at its core, because it is breaking this relationship. It is Israel defiantly looking back at God and saying, we reject you. We reject to receive all the things that you can give to us. And not just Israel, but us. This is what we do every single time, friends. Every single time that you and I look to anything other than God, for what only God can really give to us, for the kind of life that we think we want to live apart from him, where we don't trust him with our lives. See, I want us to see that sin is not just rule breaking, but it is relationship breaking. And that makes all the difference, because if you just think that it is rule breaking, ultimately it's really hard to have a deep sense of remorse. You know, this happens a lot in my relationship with my wife. If I do something that she's upset about, and if I just make it about the thing, about the action that I did, okay, I'm sorry I shrunk your clothes again. Like, gosh, what's the big deal? Like, we'll just buy another pair of jeans. But when I realize that it's relationship breaking, it's no longer about the jeans. It's about the relationship. It's about her heart. It's about either strengthening and growing in that relationship out of love, or moving further in that relationship. That is what causes a very different reality as to why something like this is so heartbreaking. It looks at now not just the actions, but your motivations and your heart disposition toward God. That is the essence of sin. That is what this idolatry is showing us, is at the heart of sin. And that is what now makes sense of this divorce language that's being used, this judgment, wrathful language that's being used. Israel is now truly undeserving of keeping a relationship with God. And so God says, I will destroy these people. They're not going to actually fulfill the ultimate purpose to reflect my glory in this world. And so he says to Moses, and you know what, Moses, I'm just going to start over with you. Because you didn't indulge in those things. You're up here with me on the mountain. You're not implicated in what Israel has done. Your name is still okay. Your favor with me is still intact. Your relationship with me is still intact. And so I will just start over with you because you didn't fail. But instead of leaving the Israelites to destruction, do you know what Moses does here in this moment? He mediates on behalf of his people. And we read it in our passage, this wonderful rhetorical defense that he gives to God. He says, no, your glory is at stake, Lord. What would the Israelites think? Why did you bring us out? If you're just going to destroy us, your glory, your name, your fame is at stake. Don't do it for that. And then finally, in verse 13, he gives his strongest argument, and he says this, look with me. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self. And you said to them, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land that I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever. Moses appeals to God's own promise that he made on the basis of himself, where he is saying, God, you have put your name on these people. You put your name on these people, no matter how corrupt or how unfaithful or how many times they fail you, because you never saved Israel because they were so great. You saved them because you are great, and you have promised to make them a great nation, a holy priesthood. That is what you have said, and that is what Moses appeals to. And as Moses is playing this role as mediator, I want you to realize the risk that Moses is taking. He is standing on the front line in between God's rightful judgment and his sinful, unrightful, judgment-filled, deserving people. And it's even more than that. He gives up and sacrifices, because what is God promising Moses? He says, you know what? I'll start over with you. You will be the new Abraham. I'll make your descendants great because you deserve it, not them. But instead of choosing himself, Moses, he intercedes on behalf of Israel. Even though that they disowned him, they said, who is this fellow? Moses never disowns them and continues to intercede and plays this mediating role. That when the Israelites were unwilling to be vulnerable and wait, Moses becomes completely vulnerable before God in order to mediate on behalf of his people, not for himself. And so we read in verse 14 this. Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster that he had threatened. This is why Moses is the greatest figure in the entire Old Testament, because he mediates for the redemption of his people. But friends, who does this sound like? Moses. The book of Hebrews says Moses in this old covenant is but a shadow of the more excellent mediator that is to come, Jesus. The truer and greater Moses, and the mediator that you and I now need for our idolatry, for our vulnerable, insecure hearts that run to anything else for our significance other than God. That we do this on a daily basis in what's going on in our hearts. We break relationship with him daily. And the Bible says that the wages of sin, the wages of breaking that relationship is death. And so therefore we need a greater Moses, a greater mediator than him to intercede for us. And do you know what happens? God the Father looks to Jesus and he says, will you go down this mountain to intercede on behalf of these corrupt people, your corrupt people, who've fallen toward idolatry, who've turned their backs on me, who've broken our marriage vows, who've been unfaithful to me? Will you go and not only risk your life, but will you give your life for them? And Jesus says, I will. He says, I will intercede fully and finally. Not just what Moses was pointing to, just the thing that Moses was pointing to, I will do finally and fully, because I will ultimately mediate for my people on the cross, where he hangs and he cries out, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing in their idolatry. They don't know what they're doing as they're rejecting you. And the wages of sin that they are due, I will pay on their behalf. I will mediate. I will take your judgment. I will take your wrath. And I will give them my status. They will be my people. And the rightful status that I have as your son, loved, approved, taken care of, now I give to them freely, so that you and I don't have to live as orphans and slaves anymore. but we can live as the very beloved sons and daughters of the God Almighty. See, Jesus does the thing, mediates the very heart of what we can never do, restore our relationship back to him. And he does it in a more beautiful way than we could ever imagine. And if you see that, my friends, if you see what he has done for you, do you know what happens? The gospel. It deals now with our vulnerability, our insecure hearts, our orphan slave mentality that wants us to run toward idols for immediate relief because we're afraid of, are we going to be okay? What the gospel says is just look to Jesus on the cross, where he proves to us once and for all that you can forever be assured, no matter what, however many times you fail, that I will never leave you or forsake you, that you can trust me, that if I'm willing to go to the cross for you, there's nothing else that I will ever hold back to give you, not just the life that you think you want, but true life, eternal life, the life that God has always intended for you, not the kind of comfort and peace and security or approval that you think you want, but ultimate comfort, ultimate peace, ultimate security. That is what Jesus provides. But only if you look to him as your mediator. And if you do, even as you fail, even as you stumble to obey and love God, you and I will show the world what Jesus has come to do, because we'll be a story not of perfection, but of redemption.